Before we begin, if you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. YouTube doesn't always make it easy to monetize this kind of content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories. You can find the link in the description and pinned comment. And for those who want story continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is where you can find it. Now, let's get into today's story. Julian's art studio was usually his sanctuary, a quiet place that smelled of linseed oil, aged canvas, and the sharp, clean scent of turpentine. But tonight, the air inside felt suffocating. Outside, a violent thunderstorm was raging, the rain lashing against the massive skylight in an angry, relentless rhythm. Julian sat on the edge of his worn velvet armchair, his hands trembling as he stared at the small, glossy strip of paper in his lap. An ultrasound. A tiny, blurry shape in the center of the dark frame. A new life. Their child. His heart was beating so fast, it felt like a trapped bird against his ribs. He had been waiting for Kael for 3 hours. The text he had sent earlier simply read, "Please come to the studio tonight. I have something to tell you. Something that changes everything." Kael had replied instantly, as he always did back then. "I'll be there." Julian closed his eyes, imagining the look on Kael's face when he showed him the photo. Kael, the sole heir to the massive Vance auction empire, a man who lived his life under the suffocating, watchful eye of a ruthless grandfather. Kael, who had always looked at Julian as if he were the only bright color in a monochrome world. They had been keeping their relationship a secret for 2 years, hiding from the press, hiding from Kael's family. But this baby would be the push they needed to finally step into the light. The heavy iron door of the studio suddenly clattered open. Julian gasped, his eyes flying open as he stood up, the ultrasound photo slipping from his fingers to land softly on the wooden floorboards. "Kael." Julian's voice was breathless with relief, a smile already forming on his lips. But the smile died the moment he saw Kael's face. Kael stood in the doorway, completely drenched in rain. His usually immaculate dark coat was clinging to his broad shoulders, his hair plastered to his forehead. But it wasn't the rain that made Julian freeze. It was Kael's eyes. They were completely hollow, cold, furious, and filled with a kind of devastating heartbreak that Julian had never seen before. "Kael!" Julian took a hesitant step forward. "What's wrong? What happened?" Kael didn't speak. He walked slowly into the room, his heavy boots leaving dark, wet footprints on the floorboards. He stopped a few feet away from Julian, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and threw it on the small glass coffee table between them. It landed with a heavy, wet smack. "Tell me it's a lie." Kael's voice was a low, dangerous rasp. It sounded like he was swallowing broken glass. "Look me in the eyes, Julian, and tell me that you didn't do it." Julian stared at the envelope, confusion swirling in his mind. He reached down, his fingers shaking slightly, as he opened the flap and pulled out the documents inside. They were bank transfers, emails, contracts. They were detailed, undeniable proofs showing that Julian had sold the Vance family's most guarded, confidential auction catalogs to their biggest rival in Europe. The payments were routed directly into an offshore account under Julian's name. There were even time-stamped photos of Julian meeting with the rival CEO, a meeting Julian had attended only because Kael's grandfather had explicitly asked him to deliver a supposedly harmless message. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. His grandfather, Kael's grandfather, had set him up. The old man had always hated Julian, had always seen him as a distraction, a dirty secret that was keeping Kael from marrying into another elite family. He had orchestrated this entire thing to make Julian look like a traitor. Julian looked up, his breath hitching. Kael, you have to believe me. I didn't do this. These are fake. Your grandfather? He asked me to. Don't bring my grandfather into this." Kael roared, the sound echoing violently off the brick walls. His chest heaved, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He warned me about you. He told me you were only with me for the money, for the access, and I defended you. I fought him for you. I was going to give up my entire inheritance for you, Julian." Kael took a step closer, his voice breaking. "And all this time, you were selling me out? Did you ever even love me? Or was every touch, every kiss, just a way to get closer to the vault?" Julian stood completely frozen. The air rushed out of his lungs. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears. Kael didn't believe him. The man he loved, the man he was carrying a child for, looked at him not with trust, but with absolute disgust. You think I did this?" Julian's voice was a fragile whisper. "The evidence is right there," Kael said bitterly, pointing a shaking finger at the table. "You used me." Julian looked down at the floor. Right next to Kael's wet boot lay the tiny, forgotten ultrasound photo, face down against the wood. Julian stared at it for a long, agonizing moment. The secret he had been so desperate to share suddenly felt like a weapon that would only cause more bloodshed. If Kael didn't trust him now, if Kael believed he was capable of such a filthy betrayal, how could Julian possibly trap him with a child? What would Kael say? That Julian got pregnant on purpose to extort him? The thought made Julian feel physically sick. Slowly, Julian raised his head. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a cold, protective mask. Something vital and soft inside of his heart simply snapped. "If that's what you believe," Julian said, his voice eerily calm, empty of all the desperate love it had held just moments ago, "then there is nothing left to say." Kael flinched, as if he had been physically struck. "That's it? You're not even going to fight it? You're just going to admit it?" "I'm not admitting to anything," Julian said softly, his eyes locking onto Kael's. "But I won't beg someone to believe in my heart when they've already decided I'm a monster. You made your choice, Kael. You chose the paper over me. Because the paper doesn't lie," Kael shouted, a tear finally escaping and cutting a warm path down his cold cheek. "Get out. I don't ever want to see your face again. If you stay in this city, I swear to God, Julian, I will make sure you never work in art again. Leave." The word fell between them like a guillotine. Julian didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply nodded, a slow, heartbreaking acceptance. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against Kael's wet boot, as he discreetly picked up the face-down ultrasound photo and slipped it into his pocket. "Goodbye, Kael," Julian whispered. He walked past the man he loved, stepping out into the freezing rain, leaving his sanctuary and his heart behind. Kael didn't remember how long he stood in that empty studio. The smell of Julian was still everywhere. Vanilla, oil paint, and that soft, warm scent that always meant home. Kael sank to his knees, clutching the edge of the coffee table, and finally let the tears fall, screaming into the empty room until his throat was raw. He thought he had cut out a cancer, but it felt like he had just ripped out his own heart. The next morning, Julian packed a single suitcase. He didn't take any of the expensive gifts Kael had bought him. He didn't take the rare paints or the fine clothes. He took only what he had brought into the relationship: a few changes of clothes, his sketchbooks, and his dignity. He sat on a train heading towards the coast, his hand resting gently over his flat stomach. The rhythmic clacking of the train on the tracks felt like a countdown, putting miles and miles between him and the life he was supposed to have. He rested his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the city skyline fade into a gray blur. "It's just you and me now," Julian whispered into the empty carriage, his fingers curling protectively over his abdomen. "I'll keep you safe, I promise." 3 days later, Kael stormed into his grandfather's sprawling estate. The anger that had sustained him through the breakup was beginning to crack, replaced by a nagging, gnawing doubt. Julian hadn't fought back. Julian had looked at him not with guilt, but with a profound, shattering disappointment. Kael bypassed the security and kicked open the heavy oak doors to his grandfather's study. The old man was sitting at his desk, sipping brandy, looking far too pleased with himself. "You look terrible, Kael," his grandfather noted smoothly. "The offshore account?" Kael demanded, his voice dangerously low. "I ran a deeper trace on it. The IP address that set it up came from inside this house." His grandfather's hand paused in the air. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, the old man set his glass down. "It was for your own good. The boy was a parasite. I simply sped up the inevitable." Kael felt the floor drop out from underneath him. The air in the room suddenly turned to ice. "You set him up," Kael breathed, his eyes wide with horror. "You faked the evidence." "I protected our legacy," the old man barked, standing up. "He was nothing, a poor restorer with no connections. You were ready to throw away your future for him. I gave you the push you needed." Kael didn't hear the rest of the speech. A deafening roar filled his ears. "I didn't do this," Julian had said. "You chose the paper over me." "No," Kael choked out, staggering backward. "No, no, no." He turned and ran. He drove like a madman back to Julian's studio, abandoning his car in the middle of the street. He sprinted up the stairs, his lungs burning, his keys fumbling in the lock. "Julian!" Kael tore the door open, but the studio was completely empty. The canvases were gone. The brushes were cleared away. The air was stale, stripped of the vanilla and oil paint that Kael loved so much. Only a thin layer of dust remained. Julian had vanished. "Julian?" Kael fell to his knees in the center of the empty room, his hands tearing at his own hair, as a sob of pure agony ripped through his chest. "God, no. What have I done? Julian, please." But the room offered no answer. For the first year, Kael searched like a man possessed. He hired private investigators, he hacked databases, he spent millions trying to track down Julian's whereabouts. But Julian had anticipated the grandfather's reach and had disappeared into the shadows completely, leaving no paper trail, no digital footprint. The guilt began to consume Kael from the inside out. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating properly. The only thing that kept him going was a cold, violent rage. In less than 2 years, Kael systematically destroyed his grandfather's allies within the company. He staged a hostile takeover, stripping the old man of his power and forcing him into an early, humiliating retirement. Kael became the CEO, ruling the Vance empire with an iron fist. The media called him a brilliant, untouchable tyrant. They didn't see the man who went home to a massive, empty penthouse every night. They didn't see Kael sleeping on the floor of his closet because the bed felt too big and too cold without Julian. They didn't see him clutching an old, paint-stained shirt that Julian had left behind, breathing in the fading scent, whispering apologies into the dark. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please come back to me." Far away, in a quiet, wind-swept coastal town, Julian was living a completely different life. The birth had been terrifying. Julian was alone in a small clinic, the pain tearing through him in waves that made him see white. He had gripped the metal bed rails, sweating and sobbing, calling out a name he had promised himself he would forget. "Kael, Kael, please, it hurts." But when he finally heard that sharp, desperate cry, when the nurses placed a tiny, warm bundle onto his exhausted chest, all the pain simply evaporated. Julian looked down at his son and stopped breathing. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were the exact shade of silver gray that Julian saw in his dreams every night. Julian whispered, tears streaming down his face as he kissed the baby's incredibly soft cheek. "My beautiful Elian." The years passed quietly. Julian built a small, modest life. He worked restoring antique furniture and local paintings, earning just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Elian grew into a quiet, deeply observant child. By the time he was 3, the resemblance to Kael was so striking, it physically hurt Julian to look at him sometimes. Elian had Kael's stubborn chin, his serious furrowed brows when he was concentrating on a puzzle, and that same, intense gaze. On cold nights, Julian would sit by Elian's bed, holding the boy's small hand. Elian would look up with those silver eyes and ask the same question he always asked. "Papa, where is my other daddy?" Julian would swallow the lump in his throat, forcing a gentle smile. He never lied to Elian. He never painted Kael as a villain. "He's very far away," Julian would whisper softly, brushing the dark curls from Elian's forehead. "But he's very strong and very brave, and if he knew you were here, he would love you more than anything in the entire world." "Does he love you, Papa?" Elian would ask sleepily. Julian would close his eyes, the old wound aching in his chest. "He did once, very much. And before we get to the moment that changes everything, I just want to pause and take a breath with you guys. If you are deeply invested in this story and want to help me continue creating these intense emotional journeys, consider supporting the channel over on my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. It's a warm, welcoming community where we share a love for storytelling, and you get access to early releases and exclusive content. The link is right down below. Now, let's get back to Julian and Kael. By the 4th year, the silence between them was broken by necessity. The coastal town's local gallery had acquired a severely damaged Renaissance painting, something beyond the scope of a small-town budget. The gallery owner, who had become a close friend, begged Julian to take it to the city to secure funding and proper laboratory equipment for the restoration. Julian hesitated for days. The city was Kael's domain, but Elion was developing a minor but chronic respiratory issue, and the best specialists were in the city. The money from this job could pay for the treatments. Julian had no choice. He packed their bags, holding 4-year-old Elion's hand as they boarded the train. As the towering, glittering skyline of the city came into view, Julian's chest tightened so painfully he had to gasp for air. It had been 4 years of ghosts. He settled Elion into a modest rented apartment with a trusted nanny for the evenings and threw himself into the restoration work. A week later, the gallery hosted a high society gala to reveal the partially restored piece and secure the final funding. Julian was forced to attend. He stood in the corner of the grand, crystal chandelier-lit ballroom, wearing a simple but elegant black suit, sipping sparkling water and trying to remain invisible. The room was buzzing with wealthy investors, clinking champagne glasses, and the heavy scent of expensive perfumes. And then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Julian felt it before he saw it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A familiar, electric charge rippled through the air. He turned his head slowly, and there he was. Kael. He looked older, sharper, more dangerous. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue suit that clung perfectly to his broad frame. His jaw was clenched, his expression unreadable, a mask of pure ice. Clinging to his arm was a stunning, polished woman, a high-profile model the tabloids claimed was his new partner. Julian's heart stopped. The glass in his hand trembled so violently the water sloshed over the rim. Kael was here, and he had moved on. As if pulled by some invisible string, Kael's head suddenly turned. Across the crowded, glittering room, their eyes met. Time completely froze. Kael's step faltered. The mask of ice fractured for a microsecond. His silver eyes went wide, his breath catching visibly in his chest. Julian! The name echoed in Kael's mind like a gunshot. He was here. He was actually here, standing in the flesh, looking just as beautiful, just as ethereal as the day he left. Every instinct in Kael screamed at him to run across the room, to grab Julian, to fall on his knees and beg for forgiveness. He knew the truth now. He had known for 3 years that Julian was innocent. He had tortured himself every single night over it. But as Kael stared at Julian, a dark, terrifying fear gripped his heart. Julian had left him. Julian hadn't fought for them. And for 4 years, Julian hadn't reached out once. If Kael showed his desperation now, if he laid his bleeding heart at Julian's feet, Julian could just crush it and walk away again. The fear of being abandoned a second time was so paralyzing, it triggered Kael's defense mechanism. Kael forced the ice back into his eyes. He hardened his jaw, pulling the woman on his arm slightly closer, projecting an image of total, detached control. Julian saw the shift. He saw the shock in Kael's eyes, instantly replaced by a cold, dismissive glare. The woman leaning against Kael felt like a knife twisting in Julian's gut. He really doesn't care anymore, Julian thought, his chest caving in. He thinks I'm a traitor, and he's erased me. Unable to bear it, Julian set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray and turned, practically fleeing toward the balcony to catch his breath. The cool night air hit his face, but it didn't stop the tears from burning the corners of his eyes. Running away again? Julian gasped, spinning around. Kael stood in the doorway of the balcony, the warm light of the ballroom casting him in a sharp silhouette. He stepped out into the dark, closing the glass door behind him, cutting off the noise of the party. Kael, Julian breathed, his voice trembling. Kael took a step closer. His heart was violently throwing itself against his ribs, but his voice came out measured, flat, and cruel. You have a lot of nerve showing your face in this city again. Did you run out of offshore funds? Need a new mark? Julian flinched, the words striking him like physical blows. I'm here for work, Kael. That's all. I didn't know you would be here. Kael closed the distance between them until they were only inches apart. The scent of vanilla and rain filled Kael's senses, intoxicating him, tearing his resolve to shreds. God, he wanted to touch him. He wanted to bury his face in Julian's neck and never let go. You haven't changed, Kael said, his voice dropping to a low, bitter whisper, still playing the innocent victim. Julian looked up into Kael's eyes, searching for the man he used to love. But all he saw was a wall of impenetrable ice. Julian swallowed hard, gathering whatever courage he had left. I never lied to you, Kael, Julian said softly, his voice remarkably steady despite the tears pooling in his eyes. I never betrayed you. You can hate me for leaving, but I won't let you call me a thief. I left because you didn't believe in me. Kael's jaw ticked. His hands, hidden in his pockets, were clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. I know, Kael thought desperately. I know you didn't do it. I know I broke us. But the words wouldn't come out. The terrifying vulnerability was trapped behind a wall of pride and fear. You left, Kael said coldly, because it was easier than staying. Kael turned his back, unable to look at Julian's tear-filled eyes for another second without breaking down. Stay out of my way, Julian. We have nothing left to say to each other. Kael walked back into the ballroom, leaving Julian alone in the dark. Julian gripped the balcony railing, his knees shaking so badly he almost collapsed. The rejection was absolute. Kael had made his stance perfectly clear. But as Julian stood there, the memory of Elian's silver eyes flashed in his mind. Does he love you, Papa? Julian wiped his eyes fiercely. No, he wasn't going to run this time. He was a father now. He had spent 4 years running from the pain, but Kael deserved to know the truth. Kael deserved to know he had a son. Even if Kael hated him, Julian had to try. For Elian. The next day, Julian began his silent pursuit. He didn't call, he didn't text. Instead, he went to the massive glass and steel tower of the Vance Empire. He didn't ask to be let in. He knew security would throw him out. So, he simply waited outside. It started raining around noon. A cold, miserable city rain. Julian stood on the sidewalk across the street, huddled in his coat, holding an umbrella, watching the entrance. Up on the 40th floor, Kael stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, his breath caught in his throat. He had been watching Julian for hours. Why are you doing this? Kael whispered to the empty glass, his hand pressing against the pane. Every minute Julian stood in the rain, a piece of Kael's armor chipped away. He wanted to order security to bring Julian up. He wanted to run down there with his own coat and wrap Julian in it. But the terror of Julian rejecting his apology, the fear of hoping again, kept Kael frozen in place. For 3 days, Julian did this. He would drop Elian at the nanny's, work at the gallery, and then stand outside Kael's building for hours in the biting cold. By the 4th day, Julian realized standing outside wasn't enough. He needed to force Kael to look at him. He needed Kael to see Elian. It was a Friday afternoon. The lobby of the Vance building was bustling with executives. Julian walked through the revolving glass doors, holding little Elian tightly in his arms. The toddler was resting his head on Julian's shoulder, his dark curls falling over his forehead, his silver eyes looking around the massive lobby with quiet curiosity. Julian approached the front desk, his heart pounding in his ears. I need to see Kael Vance. Tell him Julian is here. Before the receptionist could even answer, a sharp, mocking voice cut through the air. Well, if it isn't the runaway restorer. Julian turned. Walking toward them was Marcus, Kael's cousin, a bitter, cruel man who had always been jealous of Kael's power. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his eyes raking over Julian with deep disdain before dropping to the child in Julian's arms. What is this, Julian? Marcus sneered loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the lobby. Did the money run out? Are you here to beg Kael for a handout? Bringing a prop to make yourself look sympathetic? Julian tightened his grip on Elian, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. I'm not here for money. I need to speak to Kael. It's none of your business. It is my business. When a corporate spy tries to crawl back into our building, Marcus laughed coldly. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. And whose bastard is that? Did you find some other rich alpha to leech off of before they threw you out too? Don't talk about my son like that. Julian raised his voice, his protective instincts flaring. Elian whimpered, burying his face deeper into Julian's neck. Just then, the private VIP elevator dinged, and the silver doors slid open. Kael stepped out, flanked by 2 assistants. He was looking down at a tablet, but the sound of Julian's voice made him snap his head up instantly. Kael froze. The entire world ceased to exist. The lobby, the assistants, Marcus, they all vanished into a blur of background noise. All Kael could see was Julian, and the child in his arms. Elian turned his head at the sound of the elevator. For the first time, across 30 feet of polished marble, Kael Vance locked eyes with his son. The physical impact of it nearly knocked Kael off his feet. Those eyes. They were his eyes. The shape of the jaw, the dark hair. It was like looking into a mirror of his own childhood. A child. Julian had my child. The realization hit Kael like a freight train. The math slammed into his brain. 4 years. Julian had been pregnant when he left. When Kael had kicked him out into the rain, Julian had been carrying their baby. Guilt, shock, and a love so fierce it felt like a heart attack exploded in Kael's chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He stood there, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what he had destroyed. Julian looked at Kael. He saw Kael staring at Elian. He waited. He waited for Kael to step forward. He waited for Kael to shut Marcus up, to claim them, to show even a single ounce of care. But Kael was frozen in his shock, unable to take a step, terrified that if he moved, he would shatter into a million pieces right there in the lobby. To Julian, that hesitation was an answer. Julian's heart broke, cleanly and finally. He saw Kael standing there in his expensive suit, silent, detached, refusing to acknowledge them in front of his company. "I see," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He pulled Elian closer, pressing a kiss to the boy's hair. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come." Julian turned on his heel. "Julian!" Kael choked out, his voice barely a rasp, his hand reaching out. But it was too late. Julian was already walking fast, pushing through the revolving doors and disappearing into the crowded city streets. Kael stood there, his hand hovering in the empty air. "Can you believe the nerve of that guy?" Marcus scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. "Trying to parade some brat in here like it means something to us." Kael slowly turned his head to look at Marcus. The shock in Kael's eyes was gone, replaced by a rage so dark and terrifying that the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. "You're fired," Kael said, his voice deadly quiet. Marcus blinked. "What?" "Kael, be reasonable. I was just—" "Security," Kael barked, not breaking eye contact with his cousin. "Throw him out onto the street. If he ever steps foot in this building again, I will personally break his legs." Without waiting to watch it happen, Kael turned and sprinted toward the exit. By the time Julian reached the rented apartment, he was entirely hollowed out. He set Elian down on the couch, turning on a cartoon for him, and walked into the bedroom. He pulled his suitcase out from under the bed. He was done fighting. He was done waiting outside in the rain. He had brought Kael's son right to him, and Kael had just watched them be humiliated. There was no love left in that man. Kael's heart was truly turned to stone. Julian pulled his phone out with trembling fingers. He opened his messages and stared at Kael's name. The cursor blinked steadily, like a mocking heartbeat. Julian typed, the tears finally spilling over his lashes and dropping onto the screen. "Kael, I won't bother you anymore. I never lied to you about the documents, but I did hide something from you. The child is yours. I came today because I wanted you to meet your son. I wanted to try one last time, but I see now that you have moved on, and you don't want us in your life. I'm sorry for disrupting your peace. We are leaving the city tonight, and I won't contact you again, but no matter how cold you've become, I want you to know, I never stopped loving you. Goodbye." Julian hit send. He threw the phone onto the bed and covered his face with his hands, finally breaking down into deep, wrenching sobs. Across the city, Kael was running down the street, ignoring his driver, ignoring the rain that had started to fall again. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his chest heaving as he read the message. "The child is yours. I never stopped loving you. We are leaving tonight." The wall of ice inside Kael didn't just crack. It completely shattered, taking his fear, his pride, and his hesitation with it. No. Kael ran. He ran faster than he ever had in his life. He hailed a cab, practically throwing the driver a stack of cash, screaming the address of the gallery Julian had been working with, demanding the residential address they had on file. Julian had just finished zipping up the suitcase. He wiped his swollen eyes, plastering on a brave face as he walked out into the living room. "Come on, Elian," he said softly. "It's time to go home." Suddenly, a frantic, violent knocking hammered against the apartment door. Julian froze. His heart leaped into his throat. He hesitated, then walked slowly to the door, peering through the peephole. He gasped, stepping back and unlocking the deadbolt. The door flew open. Kael stood there, chest heaving, hair dripping wet, his expensive suit ruined by the rain. His silver eyes were red and wild, completely stripped of the cold CEO facade. He looked exactly like the man Julian had fallen in love with all those years ago. Vulnerable, desperate, and deeply in love. "Kael," Julian whispered. "Don't leave," Kael begged. The words tore out of his throat, raw and broken. He stepped into the apartment and shut the door behind him, not caring that he was dripping water everywhere. "Please, God, Julian, don't leave me again." Julian stepped back, shaking his head. "You didn't do anything, Kael. You stood there and let him humiliate us. You didn't even look at—" "I was terrified," Kael shouted, his voice cracking as tears finally spilled down his face. "I was so terrified I couldn't breathe." Julian stopped, stunned by the raw agony in Kael's voice. Kael closed the distance between them, falling to his knees right in front of Julian. He grabbed Julian's hands, pressing them desperately against his own wet cheeks. "I know you didn't betray me," Kael sobbed, looking up at Julian with absolute devastation. "I found out 3 days after you left. My grandfather faked the documents. I knew, Julian. I've known for 4 years that I broke the only pure thing I ever had. I destroyed our life." Julian's breath hitched. You knew?" "I searched everywhere for you," Kael choked out, kissing Julian's knuckles. "I overthrew my grandfather. I took the company. I tried to build a world where no one could ever hurt you again, but I couldn't find you. And when you showed up at that gala, Julian, I wanted to die from the relief. But I was so scared." "Scared of what?" Julian whispered, tears falling freely now. "Scared that you would never forgive me," Kael confessed, resting his forehead against Julian's stomach, weeping openly. "Scared that if I let you in, you would realize how broken I am and leave me for real. When I saw our son in the lobby today, Julian, I thought my heart was going to stop. I didn't step forward because I didn't think I deserved to touch him. I didn't think I deserved you." Julian stared down at the powerful, untouchable CEO, reduced to a trembling, weeping mess at his feet. The anger and the hurt that had built up over 4 years melted away, washed clean by the undeniable truth of Kael's tears. Julian slowly pulled his hands free, only to cup Kael's face, lifting it up. "You fool," Julian whispered gently. "You absolute fool. You think I stood outside in the rain for days for a man I didn't want?" Kael let out a breathless, wet laugh, surging upward. He wrapped his arms around Julian's waist, pulling him flush against his chest, and buried his face in Julian's neck, breathing in the scent of vanilla and rain like it was oxygen. "I'm sorry," Kael murmured against his skin, over and over again. "I love you. I never stopped. I will spend the rest of my life making this right. I swear it." Julian wrapped his arms around Kael's broad shoulders, closing his eyes as a profound, warm peace finally settled in his heart. "Just don't ever let me go again." "Never," Kael vowed fiercely. He pulled back just enough to look at Julian's lips, his eyes dark with longing. Julian nodded, a silent permission, and Kael kissed him. It wasn't rushed. It was deep, tender, and intensely emotional, tasting of salt and rain and 4 years of desperate yearning. Kael's large hand came up to cradle the back of Julian's head, holding him as if he were the most precious thing in the universe. A small, quiet voice interrupted them. "Papa?" Julian and Kael slowly pulled apart, both of them turning their heads. Elian was standing by the couch, clutching a small stuffed bear, staring at them with wide, silver eyes. Kael let out a shaky breath. He slowly released Julian and dropped down onto one knee, leveling himself with the little boy. His hands were trembling so badly, he had to clench them against his thighs. "Hi," Kael whispered, his voice incredibly soft. Elian tilted his head, studying Kael's face with intense curiosity. He looked at Kael's dark hair, his jaw, and finally, his eyes. "You have my eyes," Elian stated matter-of-factly. Kael let out a tearful, bright laugh. "I do. I really do." He looked up at Julian, silently asking for permission. Julian smiled, wiping a tear from his own cheek, and nodded encouragingly. Kael looked back at Elian and held out a shaking hand. "I'm Kael," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been very far away, but I'm here now. If you'll let me, I'd like to stay." Elian looked at the hand, then looked up at Julian. "Is he the brave one, Papa?" Julian's heart swelled. "Yes, baby. He is." Elian smiled, a bright, beautiful thing, and stepped forward, placing his tiny, warm hand into Kael's large one. Okay, you can stay. Kael closed his eyes, pressing a gentle, reverent kiss to the back of his son's tiny hand, a silent promise sealing their future. He reached out with his other arm, pulling Julian down to kneel beside them, wrapping them both in a tight, protective embrace. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside, the cold was finally gone. After 4 long years of running, of misunderstandings and frozen hearts, they were finally, truly, home. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If you felt the emotion in Julian and Kael's journey, please leave a like, share this video, and let me know your favorite part in the comments below. It really helps the channel grow. And remember, if you want more stories like this, or want to read ahead with exclusive spicy continuations, head over to my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL, linked below. My heavenly angels, thank you for your endless love and support. Let's meet again with another beautiful story very soon.